Bonjour et bienvenue. Mon nom est IRWIN COTLER. Je suis le président du Centre Raoul Wallenberg pour les droits de la personne. Welcome to all of you. I'm delighted, and we are all delighted to be here today. And I'm accompanied by the co-chairs of the all-party parliamentary caucus who are with us today, including, and I regret that we can only have one representative from each party to make opening remarks, but you're free to put a question to any of the members who are here. We have with us Michael Levitt, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Anita Vanderbilt, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Human Rights, Anthony Housefather, the chair of the Committee on Justice and Human Rights, Alexandra Mendez, the Canadian delegate to the OSCE, David Sweet, the vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Human Rights, Mary Rankin, the vice chair of the Committee on Justice and Human Rights, and Judy Skro, longtime initial member of this parliamentary caucus. We have as well a special guest with us today, Shaparak Shajarizade, who is a real human rights hero from Iran, subjected to multiple arrests and imprisonment, who left Iran and is here in exile in Canada, and who will be our special guest today. We are here today to release a landmark report. The report here, Realizing Rights Over Repression in Iran, the case for Canadian Magnitsky sanctions. A similar report in French, La Défense des droits de la personne face à la répression on Iran. The report documents the massive assault on human rights in Iran today, particularly that has taken place in the year 2018, and calls for the sanctioning of the major architects of repression in Iran, including Iranian government ministers, procurator generals, judges, heads of prisons, who are responsible for the massive arrests, imprisonment, torture, and execution of the leading civil society leaders of all sectors in Iran. Accordingly, having regard to this report, we ask for four things, and very briefly in each one of them. First, the implementation of Magnitsky sanctions against these architects of repression. We were here several weeks ago and called for the sanctioning of those involved in the murder of Khashoggi, and I'm delighted that 17 of those associated with Khashoggi have since been sanctioned. Second, to combat the impunity of both the present and former ministers of justice in Iran, among others, documented in the report, responsible for what the Canadian Parliament itself referred to in a unanimous resolution when I was still an MP, the crimes against humanity of these senior officials responsible for the mass killings in Iran in 1988. 30 years later, the culture of impunity continues as they've been rewarded for their mass murder with senior positions as government officials. Third, the release of Iranian Canadians now being held in Iran, which include Saeed Malikpour, now in his 11th year of imprisonment and in failing health, which include the detainee Mariam Mombaini, the widow of the Iranian Canadian environmentalist Kavus Sayed Amani. Professor Sayed Amani was himself arbitrarily arrested and died under very suspicious circumstances in the notorious Evin prison. And also, recently, Niloufar Boyani, who's come to our attention, a McGill graduate, now under risk of execution in Iran, part of the environmentalist groups, 8 of them that were imprisoned. And finally, the release of courageous political prisoners who have a Canadian connection. They're set forth in the press release, and they include not only Saeed Malikpour, but the iconic human rights hero Nasrin Sotoudeh and those associated with her in this struggle. As I mentioned, and with this I close, 2018 has seen an unprecedented assault on human rights in Iran, some of which I've just characterized, but it fully documented in the report. One of the problems that we've had is that the international community did not speak up during the period of violations respecting human rights defenders, journalists, and the like in Saudi Arabia. That took us down the road to Khashoggi. I want to say that the Iranian officials whose violations are documented in this report make Khashoggi's murder, as brutal and atrocious as it was, make it modest by comparison, given the pervasive and persistent assault on human rights as documented by those architects of repression who we name and call for their sanctioning in this report. I'll now call upon Michael Levitt, Chair of Foreign Affairs Committee, to deliver remarks.
Thank you, Professor COTLER. It's clear that Iran is a bad actor domestically and internationally. This past year, sadly, has seen a sharp decline in the human rights situation in Iran. The Iranian people are the primary victims in the region's cruel and vindictive so-called justice system. The regime is not just maintaining its human rights violations, but it's doubling down on them, including the widespread and completely inappropriate use of capital punishment, institutional discrimination and persecution of women, the Baha'i, and LGBTQ minorities, and widespread arbitrary arrest, torture, and execution, including numerous political prisoners. I'm proud of the Canadian government's ongoing support for the Iranian people and actions over the past 3 years in holding the regime to account. Canada continues to uphold strict sanctions against Iran. Canada continues to sponsor the annual UN resolution condemning the Iranian regime's atrocious human rights record, which this year we've seen an increased number of countries support. For the past 6 years in Parliament, we've held an annual Iran Accountability Week at the Subcommittee on International Human Rights to shine a light on the regime's human rights practices and initiatives started by Professor Irwin Cotler. And I was proud to join the government in the House in voting to condemn the current regime in Iran for its ongoing sponsorship of terrorism around the world. The priority in our extremely limited relations with Iran right now must be the safe return of the 2 Canadians held as political prisoners in Iran, Saeed Malikpour and Maryam Mombaini. The Iranian regime must continue to be held to account to end the impunity of its human rights violations. I was proud to sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee as we unanimously called for Canada to adopt the Magnitsky legislation, which was immediately acted upon by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland. Canada's Magnitsky Act is one of the tools available that can be used to hold human rights violators accountable. I join with my colleagues in the Raoul Wallenberg caucus in asking the government to review and consider the use of Magnitsky sanctions on Iranian officials directly responsible for the gross human rights violations in Iran. The Iranian people deserve nothing less.
Thank you, Michael. David Sweet now, Vice Chair of the Committee. David.
Thank you very much, Irwin. And ladies and gentlemen from the press, I just wanted to say a very sincere thank you for the amount of you that are present. One of the challenges that we've had and continue to have on the International Human Rights Committee is just getting the attention of Canadians on the brutal human rights violations that happen around the world. In this case today, we're talking specifically about Iran. Listen, it predates me a long time, but since 2006 on our subcommittee, there has been no other country that has seized the subcommittee as much as Iran as far as its human rights record. They consistently and pervasively imprison, torture, and also execute their own people. They have a particular hatred towards certain minorities. You've heard of the LGBTQ community, and as well as the Baha'i, who are profoundly and inordinately persecuted and regularly imprisoned and regularly executed. They have now moved their exportation of terror all throughout the region, destabilizing the entire Middle East. They regularly make statements like they want to wipe Israel off the map, and even when challenged by media saying, "Wouldn't that kill many innocent Muslims that relate to your regime?" they simply say, "Well, that's a worthy sacrifice in order to get rid of Israel and the Jews." So there isn't any place that this regime hasn't demonstrated its total disregard for human rights. And I'm joining with my colleagues here to ask Minister Freeland, as well as the cabinet, to do all that they can to use the Magnitsky's law even more so, to sanction more, to continue to find those individuals who are listed in this report that Mr. COTLER has given to you, and to make sure that they are on the list of sanctions. But also, rather than just the Quds Force, to also make sure that the Revolutionary Guard are identified as a terror organization. This would greatly hamper the regime's ability to continue their reckless human rights record. And so I just want to say, again, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for your good work, Mr. COTLER.
David, thank you. And now, Murray Rankin, the Vice Chair of the Committee on Justice and Human Rights.
I'd first like to thank IRWIN COTLER for his constant leadership on this difficult file. I'm so proud to be part of the Wallenberg caucus. I want to say that the lens through which I look at this is, what can Canada do? We can't stand idly by and just pretend these atrocities are not taking place. We didn't stand by when Magnitsky was murdered. We stood up, we passed a law like other allies have done to make sure that sanctions could be made available. And we're, of course, opposed against that regime, Russia, in its atrocious behavior. Then we've applied it in Saudi Arabia. And now I say to you, it's time for us to do the same thing with an equally brutal regime, the regime in Iran. The lens as well that I use is rule of law. We have seen the impunity with which the justice system has acted in that country. And you contrast that with the constant need to make sure that Canada's rule of law system is functioning as well. We can show by example how a functioning rule of law system works to a country where it simply is absent. And lastly, where particularly Iranian Canadians are imprisoned and tortured and abused by that regime, we have a duty as Canadians to look after our fellow citizens. And for that, I urge the government to do what's right and to redouble its efforts to make sure that Iran is held to account on the world stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Shaparak Shajarizade, who, as I mentioned, had herself been arrested multiple times in Iran, who stood up for women's rights, for defenders of human rights like Nasrin Sotoudeh, who was her lawyer, and was recently listed by the BBC as one of the 100 most inspiring and influential women in the world today. So delighted to present to you Shaparak.
Thank you, Professor COTLER. I was a woman who joined White Wednesday campaign to oppose compulsory hijab. Compulsory hijab brought constant violence against women in the streets every day. Then I got arrested several times. When you are inside those buildings, when you are inside prisons, when you are behind those doors, you'll see there is no law, there is no justice, and you realize they can do whatever they want with you. Right now, there are lots of human rights activists. There are lots of human rights lawyers that their only crime is defending their clients. They have faced false trumped-up accusations, and their lives are at risk. My lawyer, Nazreen Sotoudeh, right now, she's on hunger strike to support Dr. Farhad Maisami. He's been on hunger strike for more than 130 days, and his life is in danger because of demanding the change for equality of men and women. Also, Arash Sadeqi's life is on jeopardy. He was a human rights activist, and still the judges don't let him have the medical care he needs. We Iranian women want women politicians to support us, not obeying compulsory hijab while they are visiting Iran, when Iranian women fight to change unjust. We want the world to support justice and target injustice. I call on government to stand in solidarity with human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaparak. And now we'll open up for questions. Questions can be put to any of those who are with us here today.
Professor COTLER, I have a question for your guest. But before I get there, so the people you've laid out in here, do you have any reason to believe that either they have assets held in Canada or travel plans, or that there would be any effect in practical terms of imposing sanctions on these people? Like, you've targeted certain names. I'm just curious as to whether there's a practical effect if this were to be implemented.
Well, some, and you'll see the Express Canadian link, and just in that, some 7 of the people who we name have had an involvement in the arrest, the prosecution, the imprisonment, the torture of Iranian Canadians or political prisoners on whose behalf we are acting. So it's important, therefore, if nothing else, to name and shame these people at the same time as we call for Magnitsky sanctions in the event that they should choose to travel to Canada or have assets in Canada or seek economic relations with Canadians and the like. All these matters would be prohibited, and it would be a way both of protecting our own Canadian sovereignty and Canadian people, and at the same time protecting the Iranian people and holding the architects of repression accountable. And I should say, then you will see in the documentation of the architects of repression that one or more of them have called for the assassination of dissidents in Canada and have in fact had relations in that regard, though the specifics of their relationships are as yet unknown.
Can I just also follow up? You're asking for basically the Canadian government to take a harder line on Iran. Does the arrest, or Canada's agreement to arrest the executive of Huawei in support of the U.S. investigation against violations on the Iran sanctions, is that something you approve of? Do you think that does that show any will on Canada's part to take seriously sanctions against Iran?
Well, I just want to say on that, because the matter is right now, I think, before the courts as we speak, This is a matter from a government point of view, and I say this as a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General, where the decision with regard to extradition is in the exclusive jurisdiction of the Minister of Justice and Attorney General. Whoever he or she may be does not have to go to Cabinet and doesn't go to Cabinet in order to seek the approval with respect to that extradition. And this is a matter wherein, unless the request from the United States would come from a particular state that has capital punishment, and we do not extradite to countries who have capital punishment, we would have sought in that regard an agreement by the United States not to execute, but as a matter of convention, the extradition would go forward.
So to your guest, would you like to step forward? I'm just curious if you feel that if Canada were to act on this kind of thing, what impact would that practically have on the people you're advocating for?
I guess it would put pressure on the government, on Iranian government, to have simply justice in our courtrooms and release the activists and lawyers. They're not criminals. They're just defending human rights, and they shouldn't be inside prisons. I guess targeting those judges, those, as Professor COTLER said, architects of repression, it may help the prisoners. It may put some pressure on government.
They'd be treated worse? They'd suffer worse mistreatment?
I don't think so. I guess I hope it helped them.
Mr. Levitt, you called for...
Just for a second, Michael, because just an express answer for all of you, and specifically to Tonda. The first profile of the architects of repression, Mahmoud Alavi, you will see at the end of his profile, quote, he is also responsible for a program of harassment and assassination of Iranians abroad. In 2017, Alavi boasted of operating regime agents in Canada.
Mr. Levitt, I just want to be clear, are you calling for the use of the Magnitsky Law or consideration of the use of the Magnitsky Law?
Well, I think we've been very clear that the Magnitsky Law is another tool in the tool chest. I documented, I laid out a number of the steps that the Canadian government has taken. This is a new one. We've now used it, I think, in 6 other cases. We've applied it in as you heard, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Sudan, Venezuela, Myanmar, Saudi Arabia. Okay, so maybe 5 others. So this should be given consideration, and that's something, again, that these profiles are here, the profiles of these individuals that are responsible for absolutely abhorrent acts of human rights violation. The very point of the Magnitsky legislation is to hold those responsible for gross human rights violations to account for 2 reasons. One, in terms of assets they may have, but also in terms, as Professor COTLER said, naming and shaming them, making it clear that in Canada, as in other places, these people will not be free and clear to do this without being called out. And I think it's something that should be given serious consideration.
When you sit in the Liberal caucus, do you think Minister Freeland buys that? Do you think there's a chance she'll do this? Have you talked to her about it?
So that's something, again, we've seen very significant action taken by our government on Iran. All members of parliament across party lines have stood up for the accountability of the Iranian regime on this point. The government has condemned previous acts by Iran in terms of both their international and their domestic repression. And I think this is something that will be given serious consideration. So I would certainly encourage it.
Can I ask, perhaps as well, then has the initial discussion that this government had about re-engaging with Iran gone anywhere? Do you feel that has actually worked counter to the goals your group has? In other words, even saying that they want to re-engage with Iran, is that dignifying a nation state that you don't think should be engaged with?
I think that there was a vote in Parliament last June that made it very clear that the level of engagement that's occurring, as I mentioned during my remarks, is strictly for securing the safe release of Canadians being held in Iran. And I think the Minister has been very clear that that is the priority. That is the only discussion that is taking place between our countries, securing the safe release of Canadians being held in Iran. And I fully support that we need to do everything we can, as MP Rankin said, doubling our efforts to do that, but also looking at how we can continue to hold these gross human rights abusers to account.
I just want to ask broadly for everyone who wants to address it. There aren't a lot of things that we get multi-party agreement on these days. What makes this important? Perhaps Mr. Sweet or Mr. Rankin can address why you think this is such a critical issue.
I think because human rights are universal rights. We have had a declaration of the United Nations that we're celebrating on that point. And, you know, it seems to me this is the Parliament working at its best. The Wallenberg Caucus is one example, the Human Rights Committee, the Subcommittee of Foreign Affairs. You know, I think really it's really inspiring to see us come together on issues like this where we speak with one voice.
The only thing I'd add is that listen, there'll be other countries who'd be agreed upon as well, but the level of brutality that we're talking about, the longevity of the human rights violations, I think for all of us, we may have some small disagreements on the actual approach and procedure of how to sanction these countries, but we're unanimous as far as the need for it to happen.
I'll just close by saying that one of the things that also unites all of us from different parties, myself as a former MP, is that we stand here in solidarity with the Iranian people. And what is sometimes forgotten are the daily assaults on the fundamental rights of the Iranian people, what I've elsewhere called the criminalization of innocence. These are people who are being arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and even murdered for doing nothing else than seeking to uphold the rights that Iran has undertaken to protect as a state party to international treaties and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 70th anniversary we are commemorating today. Iran is a party to that as well. So we are saying to the Iranian government, uphold the commitments you have undertaken, cease and desist from the massive assaults on the human rights of your people. And if you do not do so, and so long as you continue to violate those fundamental rights, we will continue to hold you accountable on behalf of the Iranian people, whom you seek constantly to not only arrest, imprison, torture, and kill, but to silence. And today, we speak on their behalf. Thank you for being with us.